iOS 6 was a very unique iOS version, due to it being the very last iOS to feature the classic skeuomorphic design language. And I have plenty of videos on iOS 6, so I compiled a bunch of these videos into one, and yeah, let's get into this. iOS 6 is by far one of the most unique iOS versions, due to it being the very last iOS to feature the older skeuomorphic design language, and it having the very first version of Apple Maps, which was very buggy. But on beta, it is even more unique. So I had an idea. Let's check out the very first beta of iOS 6 on an iPhone 4S. So let's get into this. So it's time to connect my 4S up to my Linux computer and start restoring this onto here. We will be doing this with a program known as Legacy iOS Kit. So we're going to use something called Powder Snow to do this. And Powder Snow uses iOS 7.1x blobs on the iPhone 4S to do downgrades. As you can see, I have it downgraded iOS 5 currently with Powder Snow, but I'm going to make that now iOS 6.0 beta 1. So I'm going to go select my target IPSW, which should be the 6.0 IPSW right here. Select my base IPSW, which is 7.1, and then finally my SHSH, which is right here. And okay, we're now going to start the restore. iOS beta detected jailbreak option might not work properly. Now I'm gonna attempt this anyway. I'm just gonna hit yes. Memory option, yes. Verbose boot, no. And I'm going to use KDFU because I have OpenSSH installed and it's currently jailbroken. So I'm going to use KDFU. I'm going to put in my root password, which is ALPINE. Hit enter, and let's see if we have any luck right here. Okay, so I was having issues restoring a second ago with the jailbreak option. So I'm now restoring with the jailbreak option. Again, skip to the next timestamp if you don't want to see this. I'll put this on time lapse. Okay, now the device is about to flash as restoring has just finished. So I'll just put this right here. And okay, we have gotten to the setup screen. But anyway, just to show you, I'm on the very first beta of iOS 6. And now let's just get into the differences to the final release. Starting off with the YouTube app. You see, on iOS 6.0 beta 1, the classic built-in YouTube app is still present, as on final release, this is not present. I believe it was removed in beta 4. And the reason for this is Google wanted people on iOS to download their separate YouTube app from the App Store. This all kind of stems from Apple and Google's relationship souring and then becoming competitors. As when the first iPhone released with iPhone OS 1 and back in 2007, Apple and Google were of course close partners. So when the licensing agreement between both companies expired, and yeah, the old YouTube app just kind of disappeared on final release. And that YouTube app that you could download from the App Store on final release is not really quite the same as what you got on like iOS 6.0 beta 1 here, of course. So you can see it has a much different design, but this overall has a different UI compared to what you got on the final release. And now the next thing we're going to go over is the Passbook app. Now, I just want to start with saying this UI is not exclusive to iOS 6.0 beta 1, but is also in older versions of iOS 6, even on final release. So like if we look at like, I think this is like 6.1x versions that started happening, the Passbook app had a slightly different welcome screen compared to earlier versions of iOS 6, and overall it just kind of looks more like iOS 7 versus the much more skeuomorphic look you can see right here. Another big difference is the wallpaper selection on beta versus the final release, as some of these wallpapers are completely removed from like the final release. So like one I can very obviously see is that Earth wallpaper. That is not on final release of iOS 6. But other than that, there's only like a couple different abstract options from what I can see on the first beta. And also, the wallpaper has a slightly different preview where it looks more shadowy on here versus the final release. But other than that, of course, there is a couple different wallpapers in here. Like this one didn't get put on the final release from what I can see. Same thing with this one and these two options right here. So yeah, I don't know why they did this, especially that Earth wallpaper. That really sucks that didn't get to the final release of iOS 6. That'd be so cool. But yeah, that is the differences with the wallpapers. Let's also check out the Siri options of what you can do on here versus final release. So you can see on final release, there's a bunch of other things that you can ask Siri here. Although, let's just give this a try on 6.0 beta 1, because like a couple ones I noticed are like, you can ask about sports here, movies, stuff like that. But on beta 1, I don't see that as an option, but that doesn't mean Siri doesn't have that option. It's just not listed. Let's find that out for ourselves. When will the Yankees play? Let's try giving it a different question because it doesn't appear to be working. What are the latest MLB game scores? I don't know. I think this is just down overall. I can't get Siri to work on 6.0 beta 1. But like on final release of iOS 6, you could ask things like, what are the latest sports scores in baseball?
There are 13 MLB games for today.
But yeah, that's how it's supposed to work. I do think that was mentioned at the keynote of WWDC 2012 when they went over all the new things for Siri. So I'm not completely sure why it's not working here, but I do know Siri is overall finicky on older iOS versions. Like sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So this is sort of expected, but that kind of sucks. I know the music app was supposed to get a pretty big redesign for iOS 6, and I've heard about it being slightly different on beta 1, but this is kind of a bad comparison because I can't sync up any music with this due to me bypassing setup, but from what I can see, the UI overall looks pretty much the same, at least from the no content that you can download from the iTunes store thing. In settings, you'll not notice many differences other than the Maps app not being listed here in the settings. The Maps app does not work on both iOS versions, as you can see. There is a slightly different UI here though, with like specifically the report a problem thing here. So you can see it's much tinier on iOS 6.0 beta 1, probably because they did not know how bad this would be and how buggy it would be. But if we look at final release, it has a much bigger button, and it's bigger than pretty much all the other buttons right here, which is kind of funny because if you know about how buggy the iOS 6 Apple Maps experience was, you'll understand why they did this. I also noticed in things like the Videos app, that blue up here is a lot more lighter looking versus final release. And you also can see that in things like the Phone app. There also isn't any differences in things like the sounds, but we'll go into them anyway just because they're kind of nostalgic. Let's also go through the alert tones. I'm gonna put on tritone. But yeah, that's the sounds on iOS 6.0 beta 1. But yeah, that is the differences and other cool things about iOS 6 beta 1. Today I will be unboxing an iPad mini first generation that supposedly has never been updated. And the reason I wanted this thing was because it was in the slate color, and my buddy Mac Throwback offered to sell it to me. So I bought it, and yeah, let's get this out of the box. And here's the iPad mini 1, and I'd say it's in pretty much near mint condition. There appears to be a couple scratches in some spots, but this thing looks amazing. So let's get this thing powered on, okay? And we have the older Apple logo, so that indicates that this is, of course, running iOS 6, as if this was iOS 7, it wouldn't look like this. Now, this is a Wi-Fi model, so I don't think we have to worry about any of the setup looping nonsense, so yeah. But you definitely can tell this is iOS 6 just based on how skeuomorphic everything looks. Okay, we get through activation, but of course that doesn't mean there's not a chance that this will setup loop. So yeah, let's skip the Apple ID here. Agree. I'm gonna use Siri, of course. Don't send. And we're not setup looping, and this is definitely iOS 6. It also looks like we have a very early version of iOS 6 and a 64 gig model. So yeah, this is 6.0.2. 64 gig is very cool, and so is early iOS 6. Now, I just checked the battery health on this thing, and it looks like it's at 97%, and it's not really telling me the cycle count, but I think it's about like 3 just based on what I've been told. So it's very cool. Now let's get into why the iPad mini first gen is so unique. First of all, it was way ahead of its time. It was the very first small iPad, launching with a 7.9-inch screen, which was very much smaller compared to the norm, which was 9.7, and here you can see it on this iOS 6 iPad 4. And it features a design that is more in line with the iPhone 5, which released the same year in 2012, featuring the diamond chamfered edge on like the edges right here, which really looks very beautiful if you like catch it in the light. And something that's super weird about this iPad mini is it even had stereo speakers, as the top of the line iPad, which was the iPad 4th gen, did not even have those. And by the way, This was pretty much the budget option in their brand new iPad lineup. It also had the brand new Lightning connector, which was a massive upgrade compared to something like the 30-pin, as not only it charged faster, it was reversible. As you can see, I can just switch it right here, and yeah. So if we compare this to the 30-pin with the iPad 3rd gen, you may also notice it has this like one little marking on the right side you need to put it in, as this was not reversible whatsoever. And it also was a lot more bigger and a lot like less convenient. It also had significantly smaller screen bezels compared to something like the iPad 4th gen, as you can see, which just pretty much reused the same design that was on the previous iPad 3 and the iPad 2 that came before it, but of course with the Lightning connector. But at the very least, these devices had brand new chips in them, as the iPad mini ended up just reusing the chip that was originally first seen in 2011 iPad 2nd gen, and it was also in the iPhone 4S, and of course that is the generic A5 chip. So of course this also means this device did not get the Retina display, and in fact it has the same res as both the iPad 2 and the first generation iPad, but since it has a smaller screen, it has a denser pixel per inch. So the iPad 2 had around 332 ppi, and you can very much see it is not really Retina at all. But the iPad mini had 162, but it still overall does look pretty pixelated, especially if you zoom in very closely. But overall, it does look a lot better compared to the iPad 2. And since the iPad mini also had the same chip as the iPad 2, it also meant it only got a half gig of RAM and not the full gig of RAM that was in the iPad 4. And this is very much limiting if you're trying to do something that is very taxing on the device. Since this is also the generic A5, that also means it did not get the quad-core graphics of A6X. All of this meant this thing was capped out at 9.3.5 or iOS 9.3.6, where it really does not run well at all on that version. Even by like iOS 7, which is the second major iOS update this thing got, this thing was showing the limitations of its hardware. And a good equivalent to that, if you don't have one on iOS 7, which I don't, is finding an iPad 2 on iOS 7, and it really does not run great. And to be completely honest, the only good version this device ever ran was iOS 6, so this thing was not really future-proofed whatsoever on the software and internals front. But the design was very much future-proof for this thing. And in fact, it was reused on two other iPad minis. The Mini 2, which I have, and the Mini 3, which I don't have. It was also blown up a couple sizes, and that would become the first generation iPad Air. And when you compare it to other iPads that launched around the same time and next to it, you can very much see how much thought they put into like future-proofing this design and that they were going to use it into the future. And this thing really does feel futuristic. Because even on something like the iPad 6th gen, which only got a couple tweaks to its design because it overall just reused the same thing as the iPad Air 2, which also sort of tweaked this design, but the only real difference is that it just got a slightly thinner look and a slightly different speaker design. So technically you could say that this design was used for like forever but was modified a couple times, and like this is the iPad 6th gen, by the way. This came out in 2018. But of course this was the budget option in 2012, starting at about $329 for the base 16 gig. In comparison to the iPad 4, that started at like $500. And to be honest, for the futuristic design in the A5 chip, this wasn't that bad for people on a budget. Now back to the design again. All base model iPads up until 2012 only came with an option for having color on the bezels of the iPad, with silver on the back shell, and these like volume buttons and side buttons were always black. And if you had a cellular one, this like antenna bar up here, that was also always black, even if you had one in white. So just to show you, here is a white iPad 3rd gen, and you can see that and that. But this was very different on the iPad mini, of course, as now the color covered the whole entire back shell and the volume buttons, and also the antenna thing. So here is a silver iPad mini on iOS 6, and you can see the front bezels are also white. And of course, for the slate one, you can see it right here, and the front bezels are also black. It of course came in two color options, black and slate and white and silver. But later on, slate was replaced with space gray due to durability reasons. As like if you slightly dropped this thing or like accidentally hit this on a table, for example, it would 100% chip. In my opinion, slate 100% looks better. Like, it's not even close. Although I think they should have just refined slate, but I guess in that way, Space Gray is just a refined slate that is more durable, but it really doesn't even look as good at all. Like, it just looks garbage. The volume rocker also ended up being replaced with 2 separate buttons, as if we compare this to something like the iPad 2, which I have right here. It is one huge button with like 2 ends that you would press down on, basically. And it was replaced with like 2 metal buttons, which overall does look a bit better in my opinion. And another unique thing about this iPad is the camera. The iPad 2, which this thing is based off internally mostly, had an absolute garbage camera with sub-megapixel quality on both the front and rear camera. But this thing ended up getting a full 5 megapixel camera on the rear and a 1.2 megapixel front camera, which is sort of more in line with the iPhone 4 and iPhone 4S, although the iPhone 4S does have a 8 megapixel rear facing camera. This of course was an absolute massive improvement, and you can just see it from the front camera right here. This looks significantly better on the iPad mini versus the iPad 2. But it would have been absolutely nuts if they kept that like sub-megapixel quality camera in 2012. And it even got a very early version of 4G LTE on this thing, while the iPad 2 of course had 3G only. Which is kind of weird because you think if they were trying to keep the exact same internals, they could have just not done that and kept 3G on this thing for the cellular models. The battery is also pretty small on this thing, of course due to it having both a smaller and thinner design compared to something like the iPad 2 or the iPad 4. And also it didn't even have the Retina display if we're comparing this to the iPad 4. So this thing has a battery with around 4,500 milliamp hours, which is quite comparable to something like the modern iPhone 17 lineup, with I think the iPhone 17 Pro is around this amount of milliamp hours, if I'm not mistaken. In comparison to something like the iPad 2, that got about 7,000 milliamp hours. And if we're comparing this to the Retina iPad 4 and iPad 3, they had a battery with about 11,560 milliamp hours, which actually is quite a lot bigger compared to more modern iPads like the Air 1, Air 2, and iPad 5, and even the iPad 6. I bet the iPad 4 compared to some other new iPad batteries is even better, but I'm not really gonna throw that in my script. Now let's talk about iOS 6 on this device. iOS 6 is really the last of its time and is very unique. First of all, it's the last iOS version to have Apple's classic and older skeuomorphic design. If you do not know what skeuomorphism is, it's basically a design that mimics real-life objects. You can see this in things like the Notepad application, which looks like a real notepad. The camera app's icon, which looks like a real camera lens. And when you open it up, it has this like some sort of like shades or shade type of animation, if that's what you call them. I have no idea. Which in recent times has sort of made a return with iOS 26's clay looking recreation. But anyway, we all know a year later Apple replaced this with flat design. But you may ask, what is their main reason for redesigning their whole entire operating system? Well, with the launch of Apple Maps on iOS 6 came a massive controversy, mainly because it was super buggy. A good way I can show you this is just by looking at the icon, as it just shows someone driving off an overpass. But other than that, inside of the app, there was so many bugs. The lead dev of Apple Maps in 2012 was a dude named Scott Forstall, and he was not your ordinary dude that just made the Maps app. No, he was the lead designer of majority of Apple's skeuomorphic era, of course iOS 1 through 6. But with the massive controversy that came with the absolute horrid state of Apple Maps, Apple wanted to apologize to see if they could probably minimize some of the outrage. So Timmy Cook wrote up an apology letter and wanted Scott to sign it, which, I mean, he refused. And the result of that was somewhat of a culmination of past things that had happened. Ever since the death of Steve Jobs, Scott didn't really have anyone to advocate for his skeuomorphic designs. You see, Steve was a massive advocate for skeuomorphism, and Tim Cook was not really as pro-skeo as him. And Forstall frequently clashed with the hardware designer at the time, Jony Ive, which he will come into picture in a minute, and other top executives at Apple. And this was sort of the final straw between Tim and Scott, which they would fire and replace with Jony Ive. Now, Jony Ive was the biggest advocate for flat and minimalist designs. So the following year came the biggest visual redesign Apple has ever done. And I'd argue it's bigger than Liquid Glass and iOS 11. And if you do not know about iOS 11's redesign, it's pretty much where they just rounded everything off to accommodate for things like the iPhone X. Now, everything was completely minimalist. from things that we just looked at a second ago, like this notepad, which is still semi-skeuomorphic because it has a very slight texture there, but overall it's not really skeuomorphic in my opinion, just because it's not mimicking anything else here. But that's just kind of early flat design for you. The camera icon is also not really mimicking anything. And iOS 7 became one of the most controversial updates ever, as it pushed everyone towards the flat era. Not just Apple, they just kind of influenced everyone to do the same thing as them. But the annoying thing about iOS 7, despite its like masterclass and beautiful version of flat design, is it allows everyone to become lazy on what they design. We still are facing the effects of this update to this day with the constant minimization, but we are now kind of moving towards a post-flat era of some sorts, where everything is becoming less flat and more fun, but of course it's not going to replicate the charm of things like iOS 7, Android Lollipop, and Metro for like early flat design, and it's also not going to replicate the beautiful and very detailed skeuomorphic era, with designs like pre-2014 macOS, Aero Glass, and other things like Frutiger Aero, although Aero Glass is Frutiger Aero. But anyway, now let's just talk about some of the other things in iOS 6 that aren't the design in Apple Maps, which I do not think we need to go over again after we just explained why it's an absolute horrid dumpster fire. Siri got expanded massively, which for some reason is on the iPad mini 1, even with it having the same chip as the iPad 2, which did not get Siri. But anyway, it could tell you things like sports scores. Siri, tell me MLB scores.
There are 10 MLB games for today.
And there you go, it pulls it all up. And it could also tell you things about movies, but I'm not really going to experiment with that. Siri, tell me a joke.
I'm taking these cookies to the doctor. They feel crummy.
Wow, super creative. Anyway, it could also like do things like posting tweets, post on Facebook, and it also could launch apps. So let's try that right now. Siri, launch the camera app.
Doesn't look like you have an app named Camera.
What? Okay, let's try that again. Siri, launch Minecraft.
It doesn't look like you have an app named Minecraft.
Wow, it just doesn't care. Okay, maybe I have to try this. Siri, launch Minecraft PE.
I don't see an app called Minecraft.
Well, I guess you're just f***ing retarded. It's probably just as smart as modern Apple intelligence. And speaking of Facebook, it was completely integrated into iOS 6. As you can see, I can sign into it right from settings, although I doubt it still works. Do Not Disturb was added, which, by the way, this is not the native iOS 6 multitasking. I have a tweak from Cydia. But anyway, Do Not Disturb was like the feature where you can silence all notifications and incoming phone calls if you had a phone. Phone calls were also improved, as you could reply with a message when declining a phone call with just one button, or hit the Remind Me Later button when declining a call, as you could set a reminder for when you can call them back later. The Passbook app was also added, which is not on iPad, where you could store things like boarding passes, tickets, and coupons, which was pretty much a precursor to Apple Wallet. iOS 6 also got some privacy improvements. If you have ever seen the notifications where they ask for your location or to track you when you open up an app, and you can either decline or approve, well, in iOS 6, this is where it was implemented. As on prior iOS versions, they could silently track you on some like 1984 type shit. And the Mail app got some improvements with the VIP mailbox, where you could access emails from people you find important. Flagged emails was also added, and pull down to refresh was also added. And the Clock app was also added to the iPad. On all previous iPads, there was no Clock app whatsoever, but when they added it, you may notice they did not reuse the Clock app icon from iPhone and iPod Touch. The design of this Clock app originally came from Swiss Federal Railways, and Apple ended up having to pay $20 million just for them to use it for a year. As we all know, iOS 7 came right after. The classic YouTube app, which you can see on iOS 4 right here, was also removed from iOS 6, as Google wanted people on iOS to download their separate YouTube app from the App Store. This all kind of stems from Apple and Google's relationship souring and them becoming competitors, as when the first iPhone released with iPhone OS 1 back in 2007, Apple and Google were very close partners. So when the licensing agreement between both companies expired, and then the old YouTube app just disappeared. And to be honest, it kind of sucks. I can't lie, that old YouTube app with the retro like TV looking icon is so classic. But anyway, that's all for the history. Let's just explore the device some more. The first thing let's look at is the wallpapers, as iOS 6, to be completely honest, had a pretty weak wallpaper selection. There is only like maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 wallpapers. Actually, make that 5 and 6. 6 wallpapers out of like the 20-ish wallpapers they put on this thing. This one, which actually doesn't look bad with Slate, but I really like these ones, which were from iOS 5, This one's from iOS 5. This one's from iOS 4. This one's an ocean wallpaper, which is from like iOS 3, I believe. And this one's, I don't think, came from iOS 6. So all of these new ones really just don't stack up to the older ones that they kept, but they removed a ton of them that were originally on like iOS 4 and 5, like this classic iPad exclusive iPhone OS 3 wallpaper, this earth wallpaper, and like these other flower wallpapers which they removed. Let's also quickly go through the ringtones. Let's also go through the alert tones. I think I'm gonna put on this one. Also, with the jailbreak I used on this thing, it imports like the classic weather app onto iPad, which usually it isn't here natively, obviously, as that was added way later. But it's cool, we can go look at it. We can take a look at the classic game center with all the green felt, and the photo booth application, which I remember really liking back in the day. And here's the classic music application if you're curious on what that looks like. This is iOS 6 and this is iOS 27. Let's see how far Apple has come in these 13 years. The very first thing you will notice between iOS 27 and iOS 6 is there are major design differences between these two operating systems. On iOS 6, it features Apple's classic skeuomorphic design language, while on iOS 27, it features a much more refined version of liquid glass. With this skeuomorphic design language, things like folders are completely different to the liquid glass design language. So let's go open a folder on iOS 6 and then check out that same folder on iOS 27. So you can see in iOS 6, it features a much more textured and less glossy look, while on iOS 27, it features a all glass and very glossy look here. In settings, the layout is pretty much the same, although of course there are a bunch of other new features on iOS 27 and a much more flatter looking design with a glass bar towards the bottom, while on iOS 6, it is just straight skeuomorphism and texture, and it's quite classic looking. Things like the music app both have massive differences in terms of design. On iOS 6, it features a textured white look, while on iOS 27, you could either pick between a white background or a black background with no texture whatsoever, and it's pretty much the same thing that you would see in the settings app that we just went through. It features a flat look with liquid glass overlaid on top of this, while on iOS 6, it of course is just all this one white texture, and you can even go into cover flow and view all of your album artwork at once. And this is actually kind of more glossy looking versus something like iOS 27 if you really look at it, because this is mimicking like a glass table and it is reflecting the albums on the table, which is pretty cool looking. And of course, since iOS 27 features Apple Music, which Apple Music is completely absent from iOS 6 by the way, it does not have cover flow. The app icons on both of these iOS versions are also very drastically different looking. On iOS 27, they do have depth, but they're not really mimicking much. They're just kind of glossy and kind of abstract. On iOS 27, they also got a pretty big overhaul where they're now made of actual liquid glass, but whatever rendering they did on beta 1 makes them look quite flat. They also feature these specular highlights on the corners, which unlike iOS 26 do not move anymore. But on iOS 6, the app icons are very much skeuomorphic, as if we look at something like the Notes app, it is literally a real notepad. While if we look at that on iOS 27, you can very much see it is still sort of a notepad, but it's not really mimicking like something you would see on an actual notepad. And it looks much more minimalistic, if that makes any sense. It looks a lot less detailed versus something like iOS 6. But some certain app icons look very much like their iOS 6 counterparts. So you see that camera icon right there, right? Well, let's go look at that same camera icon on iOS 6. Looks very familiar, right? On previous flat iOS versions, it would look more like this, although it is a bit different on other iOS versions like iOS 11 and up, as the app icon is not quite the same as you'd see on iOS 7. And if we look at some more app icons, you can see things like the Maps app has a much more glossy and glassy look, while on iOS 6 it features a much more skeuomorphic look while depicting someone driving off an overpass. The Weather app is also different on both iOS versions, as on iOS 27 you can have it as both a widget and an actual app on the home screen. While on iOS 6, of course, it is just a app on the home screen as there's no widget option on iOS 6. But let's go check out the weather app on the inside on both of these iOS versions. On iOS 6, the information that you get for the weather is much more minimal, while on iOS 27, you get a ton of information, so you can see a ton more days for the temperature. It also even has an option for the radar, while of course that is completely absent from iOS 6. It also shows you things like air quality, wind, the moon, sunset, UV index, feels like temperature, averages for the day, precipitation, visibility, humidity, pressure, and other things. So it is not quite as minimal as something that you would see on iOS 6, as here you would just get the temperature, of course, and your hourly forecast. Although the one thing that has not really changed between both of these iOS versions in terms of design, it will always show you the weather condition with some sort of effect. As you can see in Cupertino right now, it is very sunny, and it shows a sunny effect. And on iOS 6, it shows Cupertino also being sunny, so it shows a sunny effect. And this can be changed with the weather, of course. So like if it was raining, it would show raining and other cool stuff like that, and it just feels pretty immersive in my opinion. Let's now look at the most essential thing on both of these phones, that being the phone app, as I mean it's a phone, you call somebody with a phone, and you can see the differences between these are pretty big. On iOS 27, of course it shows your liquid glassy look with glass floating on top of a blank background, while on iOS 6 it has a ton of shadows and it's all built into like one layer, and it overall looks a lot cooler in my opinion versus something like iOS 27. Now, I would go through my contacts and everything on here, but of course, I use this phone, so it's going to show all my contact information. Let's go back and go look at these notes apps on both of these iOS versions. On iOS 6, it is just a blank skeuomorphic notepad, and all you can do really is just type on it. While on iOS 27, you can do things like checklists. You can make, I don't even know what you would call this, another checklist? I don't know. You could add photos and documents, and you could even draw on here. So not quite as minimal as iOS 6, although in terms of design, this is the exact opposite of minimal, as of course on iOS 26 you just get your liquid glass look on top of the notes app, which is not really textured and it just shows a plain document, while on iOS 6 of course you get the notepad and everything, you get your skeuomorphic keyboard, but you don't have as nearly as many features as iOS 27. Let's also go back and take a look at the camera app on both of these iOS versions. And just to show you that I'll have the most features on iOS 6, I'm using this on an iPhone 5, so I'll get all of the features that you would normally get on iOS 6, and I wouldn't be like missing some, like if you were using an iPhone 3GS, for example. So on iOS 6, you only have a couple options. You can do HDR, you can do panorama, and it's just your standard panorama, and this is where it was introduced, I believe. And you get some other options for like grid. I'm not sure why you'd want to use this, but it is there. And you can flip the camera, of course, and you can turn on your flash, you can turn off your flash, so it's quite minimal, and you can also change it to video. But of course, phones and their operating systems have changed a ton over a bunch of years. So on iOS 27, you have a ton of options for different things. So you can go to slow-mo, you can go to time-lapse, you can go to video, your photo, portrait, pano, all of that. And there's also options for things like grid, like you normally would see, and you would get a ton of other options, like you can change your exposure, your level, your format, etc. Let's also go into things like the photo app. On iOS 6, it is much more minimal, and you can see things like your camera roll and a bunch of stuff that you've synced up with iTunes. While on iOS 27, you get your camera roll, of course, and you can see a bunch of other stuff, but of course I can't show that because it's just all my personal stuff. Although the one thing I will show you is this image of Scoobert, and he is free and heading to O-Block. Let's also take a look at something like the notification center. On iOS 26, your notification center is merged with your lock screen, while on iOS 6, it is completely separate. So you just see your notifications and a couple widgets up here. And yeah, you do get widgets on iOS 6, funny enough, but this would be the only type of widgets that you would get on iOS 6. You want to get any other widgets that you could put on the home screen, no, it would go in the notification center. And on iOS 27, your notification center and lock screen is completely customizable, and you can put a bunch of custom widgets from like third-party applications, and you can make your time look different. As you can see, I have mine super long and it is going behind my wallpaper, and you can make it super glassy. While on iOS 6, of course, it is not that simple, and even with the lock screen. On iOS 6, you just get your generic slide to unlock and a thing where you can open up your camera from here. So let's actually slide to unlock right now, just so I can show you. And on iOS 27, it is different. You would use your Face ID or you would put in your passcode. And now let's get into the wallpaper customization of both of these iOS versions. On iOS 6, it is quite simple. You just set your wallpaper. You can pick from your default selection. So I'm going to go set it to something different. Like this ocean wallpaper, I hit set both, or I can set it individually for one on your lock screen or your home screen, of course. And yeah, you can't really change what it looks like. While on iOS 27, you can go in here, you can add your wallpaper, and you can customize a ton of stuff. You can add a ton of widgets that you cannot on iOS 6. On iOS 6, I believe the only widgets you can add are your weather and your stocks. While on here, there's a ton of options for third-party apps and a bunch of other stuff, as you can very much see. And how you choose your wallpapers looks completely different on iOS 27, as I believe on iOS 16, this was changed where you can customize a bunch of stuff, and you can get wallpaper packs, you can add your own wallpapers, you can put your live weather with your live location, and stuff like that. Now, let's get into Safari on iOS 27 and iOS 6. The design is much different for both of these iOS versions, as it shows a overhead view of your tabs on iOS 27, and it will show your like liquid glass buttons up here, and you can make different tab groups and all that good business. While on iOS 6, it is much more simplified looking, and you can just go through all your tabs like this, and it is like slide overview. You can make new pages, and it's not quite as advanced as something like iOS 27. Let's also test out Siri on both of these iOS versions. Although, since I'm showing this off on an iPhone 12 Pro Max, I will not get the newest Siri that you possibly can get, and not the most advanced Siri, because of course I'm on an iPhone 12 Pro Max. So to activate Siri on iOS 27, while I don't have the action button, I would just hold the power button on the side and I would pull up Siri. So that's how it works. So I'm gonna go ask something right now to Siri, and we'll see what it gets, because it's gonna be a lot more intelligent, of course. Siri, what is the weather in Cupertino right now? And of course, it pulls up the weather immediately. Now let's go take a look at it on iOS 6. On iOS 6, you activate it by just holding the home button. Siri, what's the weather in Cupertino right now?
Searching the web for Siri, what's the weather in Cupertino right now?
And you can see it is much dumber, and that's probably due to being the weather app being like shut down completely on iOS 6, and you have to use a Cydia tweak to fix it. So let's ask it something else that would actually give you a response. Siri, what are the scores for the NBA Finals?
The Pacers lost the NBA Finals 4-3 against the Thunder. They lost the last game 103-91 on June 22nd, 2025.
And it is pretty off, because it's showing me the scores for the last NBA Finals and not the ones that are going on right now in 2026. Now let's ask that same exact question on iOS 27 Siri. Siri, what is the scores for the NBA Finals so far? And it pulls up a bunch of things for the NBA Finals, as you can see. Now let's look at the Maps app on both of these iOS versions. On iOS 27, it has ads, which is kind of crazy. But on iOS 6, it doesn't really work at all. It was very buggy back then, so there's a big button for report a problem, as this is very much the first version of Apple Maps ever. As before, on previous iOS versions, you would just get the standard Google Maps app implemented. But again, this does not work natively without tweaks, and I can't get this to work even with tweaks. On iOS 27, you get the option for an app library. If we go to look for one on iOS 6, of course that is not an option. You just get your standard home screen apps right here. And you can search your iPhone, but that is not quite the same as having a whole app library. Things like the clock app look drastically different on both of these iOS versions. So let's go look at them right now. And here I can go in here, I can set my alarms. I can pretty much do the same thing here. It's just a completely different looking design. But as you can see, it provides pretty much the same exact function on both iOS versions. So let's look at things like stopwatch. I can go to my timer thing here. I can set a timer. It just looks different. Like, there is no feature differences here. On iOS 27, you get a full-fledged news app. While on iOS 6, it is quite different. You have the newsstand application, where you can download newspapers, and it goes right in here. And this is not like a live news feed. No, you have to actually go onto the internet, grab some news feeds or whatever, your magazines, whatever you want, and you chuck it in here. And yeah, that's how that works. So it's not quite like iOS 27, where we have a full-fledged news feed here. Now, that is all the main differences you will notice between both of these iOS versions. Now, I know there is a bunch of other features differences that we could go through, but if we continue doing that, this video would go on for hours upon hours upon hours because of how bloated iOS has gotten in recent years, especially with iOS 27. And all the other differences you will notice are pretty much only in design. So like the calculator app, of course this is skeuomorphic. I'm going to point that out. You see things like the voice memos app. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say, oh, this is skeuomorphic and this is not skeuomorphic. Like, you see what I mean, right? So yeah, those are the big main differences you'll notice between iOS 6 and iOS 27. A lot of people say iOS 6 from 2012 is the peak of iOS design, but is this true? Is it better something like iOS 7? Let's find out for ourselves. Both of these iOS versions feature radically different design languages, as one features a much more skeuomorphic design language, and the later counterpart iOS 7 features a much more flatter and translucent design language. And this is very obvious from like the home screen, as if we look at the icons in iOS 7, it is very flat and it is not really skeuomorphic. And if you don't know what skeuomorphism is starting off, it is basically a digital design that mimics real life objects. So if you look at some things on here like this newsstand app, it comes out like a real bookshelf kind of. If we look at the same thing on iOS 7, you will see the difference. It's not really mimicking much. And in my personal opinion, I do prefer iOS 6 to iOS 7 in this specific instance. Let's now take a look at something like the Notes app. Now, the Notes apps are both kind of different to each other. On iOS 6, it looks like a real actual paper notepad that you could write on. And if we look at that same thing on iOS 7, everything is much more minimalistic. But if you really go look deeply into this, it may be hard to tell, but there is still some texture on iOS 7. But overall, it is quite minimal. Let's next turn our attention to something like the Photos app. Now, the Photos app on iOS 6 features a icon with a actual sunflower. And if we look at that same thing on iOS 7, it features a much less skeuomorphic looking flower right here, and it is very colorful. And if we open it up on iOS 7, it is very minimal and it's not really mimicking anything and kind of looks boring and minimalistic. Let's now turn our attention to iOS 6, and it is very glossy and skeuomorphic, and I overall prefer this look in my personal opinion. Let's now take a look at the notification center on both of these iOS versions. iOS 6 features a much more skeuomorphic look, of course, with shadows and a linen background that kind of looks like a cubicle in an office, if you know what I mean. But on iOS 7, it features this much more blurred look, and it is very not skeuomorphic. But if I'm going to be completely real here, I think iOS 7 actually looks better in this instance. It actually kind of looks pretty glassy with all the blur it has. Let's now take a look at the Weather app on both of these iOS versions. The Weather app in both of these iOS versions both drastically look different. Although I have not fixed the one on iOS 6 with a jailbreak tweak yet, so it just looks like a kind of glossy panel, but it would look like something like this on screen when fixed. I even just tried getting the tweak and it's still not working for me. But yeah, it features a much more glossy look, and when the weather changes, it also looks very cool. But I overall prefer the look of iOS 7 in this instance because the weather pretty much covers up the whole entire screen and you get your weather stuff on top of it. And I think it overall just looks a bit better in my personal opinion. Let's also now turn our attention to the docks on both of these iOS versions. Now, I'm showing you this on a 7.0x version, so the dock will look a bit more transparent on iOS 7, if that makes any sense here. But yeah, overall they are slightly different. Like if you look at like 7.1x here, it just looks a little bit less translucent. So I just want to let you guys know about that quickly. But the look on both of these iOS versions are drastically different, as on iOS 6 it features a much more glossy dock here and it's very skeuomorphic. It almost looks like a glass table and it's reflecting the app icons off that table, and it overall just looks super cool in my opinion, and I think it looks better than something like iOS 7. And this is also reminiscent of older macOS versions, like I believe it started in Leopard or Snow Leopard, where it started looking like this. It's very cool looking. I'll have to throw up an image of that, but that's what that reminds me of. But yeah, the one on iOS 7 just features some Gaussian blur, and it also does look pretty cool, but I don't think it looks nearly as cool as something like iOS 6. And even on iPad, it looks even cooler. So here's an iPad mini running iOS 6, and you can see it reflects the app icons off the dock, and also the wallpaper goes behind it. Although it's not really blurry like iOS 7, it still overall looks better in my personal opinion. And back to the icons, you may notice on iOS 6 they have some shadowing. So like, let's go really look into like that weather icon right there. You can kind of see that shadow. Let's also take a look at this iOS 6.0.2 iPad mini. You can also see that. Well, on iOS 7, most of the shadows were removed, specifically on the main release versions, and that is very visible here. There's like no shadows at all. Let's also take a look at something like slide to unlock. Now, on iOS 6, it's like much more skeuomorphic looking, and to slide to unlock, you have to slide to unlock this really tiny portion down here, and it also has the whole status bar overlaid over the wallpaper, and it's not like completely transparent like you would see on iOS 7. So let's slide to unlock on iOS 6 right now. And it also has a little sound, and that was removed on final release versions of iOS 7 and never was brought back. So let's slide to unlock. And yeah, there you go. It is a lot less more interesting and a lot less more interesting or fun, I should say. Now, honestly, I don't know which one I prefer here. I both like the look of iOS 7 and the look of iOS 6 here. Feel free to leave your thoughts down below in the comments section. I'm pretty torn on what I think looks better here. Let's now take a look at the music app on both of these iOS versions. On iOS 6, it features a much more like paper-like textured look, and when you go into cover flow, it shows you all of your albums stacked on top of each other and reflects the albums off of this like glassy table, and it looks really cool in my opinion. Now on iOS 7, of course, it is significantly more minimal. So let's go open that up right now. And yeah, you can see it just features a standard white background with no texture. And it also has some blur towards the bottom on like these bars that go over your album covers and whatever, which is kind of cool. Let's also now go into cover flow. And cover flow you can zoom in and out of also, but it's not really like skeuomorphic or fun looking, rather. It's just kind of boring and it's just a normal overhead look. Let's also take a look at the phone app. Now on later versions of iOS 7, it doesn't have this nearly squared look when you're looking at the keypad. This is specific to the 7.0x versions. And on iOS 6, of course, it looks a lot more skeuomorphic because it's a skeuomorphic design language. And speaking of 7.0x versions, let's now look at the slide to power off on both of these iOS versions. And now on iOS 6, it features a pretty similar look. I mean, excluding that it looks a lot more skeuomorphic, it has a much more squared off look on both iOS versions, but of course, it looks a lot less skeuomorphic on iOS 7 as usual. Here, I probably prefer iOS 7. And now this is not the final version of slide to power off you would see on iOS 7. This would be completely different on the 7.1x versions. So let's look at that right now. So you can see it features a much more rounded off look, and this is pretty much the same thing we see to this day on iOS 26. Well, it does kind of look different on iOS 27 betas, but we don't really talk about that. Let's also take a look at the camera app on both of these iOS versions. On iOS 6, when you first open it up, it has this like cool blades animation. I don't know what you would call this, like camera blades. I don't know, it's really cool. And you don't really have many options here. I mean, you can turn on grid and HDR and use panorama, and you can also turn on video. I mean, that's pretty simplistic. But if we look at something like iOS 7, you have a ton of options. You can do slow-mo, video, photo, square, pano, and you can choose between HDR and other things. It's very cool. But if I had to pick design, I would probably say iOS 7, but for practicality and not for like how it looks. I do think it looks better on iOS 6 in my opinion, just because it's a lot more glossy and fun looking. But here, it's a lot more flatter, but like it's a lot more easy to get to things, like get to different options. Let's also take a look at the control center on iOS 7. This is completely absent from iOS 6, as you just have standard multitasking, and multitasking is basically the predecessor to the control center. If you do not know what multitasking is, you can like change your music and close out of apps. That's just about it. While on iOS 7, you get a whole control panel with a bunch of options to mess around with. And multitasking is a completely separate thing, and it's only for closing in and out of apps. And how you close out of apps is completely different on iOS 7 versus something like iOS 6. As to close out of an app on iOS 7's multitasking, you just swipe up. While on iOS 6, you just hold down on this app icon right here and press down on it, and it's a lot less convenient. And you can also go in and out of apps like you normally could on both of these iOS versions. You just can't see the inside of the app like iOS 7 on iOS 6. And I'd say here I prefer iOS 7. Let's also take a look at the Maps app on both of these iOS versions. Now they both don't work, but you can see the design language differences here. And yeah, overall I do think iOS 6 looks better here, especially with this cool like page opening animation here. It's super cool. Let's also take a look at things like the clock app, and you'll just notice the crazy design differences between both of these iOS versions. It's just a lot more cool looking on iOS 6 versus iOS 7, and yeah, this is very obvious. It's also a lot more detailed on iOS 6 in the settings app. And now let's actually get into the wallpapers of both of these iOS versions. Now on iOS 7, you have a ton of stock nature wallpapers to choose from, while on iOS 6 there is a lot less to choose choose from, as you can very much see. I think iOS 7 is the winner here because not only it has these normal nature wallpapers, it also has dynamic wallpapers. That was a full comparison to iOS 7 and iOS 6. Now, there's a bunch of other things I could go in here and point out the difference between skeuomorphism and flat design, but it wouldn't really be interesting, so I'm just going to end it here. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing with notifications on, sharing this with someone that would find this interesting, and please consider hyping the video as it helps out the video and the channel. Also consider checking out my social media accounts and leaving a follow. I have a brand new second YouTube channel, and this is not brand new. I'm just putting my short form content on there, so feel free to go check that out. And I have a Twitter, a TikTok, where you'll probably see the same short form content that I already record there also. And yeah, I also have a Reddit. And yeah, this has been Derek from Certified Legacy, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.
What we do here is go back.